All right. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about my research I'm doing for my master's about mineralogical, geochemical, and vegetation-related controls on mobility of metals and metalloids in wastes and sediments around Cobalt, Ontario. So to start with a little background info about Cobalt, Cobalt is located about 600 kilometers north of Toronto, and it's the site of silver mining rush in the 1900s. So there are two waves of silver mining throughout the 1900s, and during this time, there were several mines and mills, as well as different processing methods used. Recently, there's been renewed interest in the cobalt region for exploring new cobalt resources, as well as expanding the first of its kind in a cobalt refinery for battery-grade cobalt in North America. However, there's some problems associated with the silver mining rush in cobalt. So this waste has been left behind since mining, and it's geochemically complex, in part because of the deposit type, which is a multi-element vein deposit, but also because of the different processing methods, which contributed things such as mercury to the waste. And as a result, there is widespread environmental contamination from mine waste in the cobalt region. Now, this leads me to some of my research goals. So my first goal is to characterize mine waste at 4 sites in cobalt, looking at both the mineralogy and the geochemistry of these wastes. I'm also investigating the relationship between mine waste and horsetails growing on the waste. These are a sort of wetland or field plant. I'm also evaluating the role of the horsetails in biogeochemical cycling of elements in this region. All right, so here are my 4 sampling sites. And in the fall of 2019, push cores were collected from these 4 sites by the GSC Atlantic. And this was prior to my master's starting. In July of 2021, I was able to get to the field myself, and I collected tailings and sediments from these 4 sites. And at LaRose Pond, near the center of the map there, I collected 3 benthic sediments from the pond using benthic sampler. I also collected horsetail samples from the 4 sites. And before I moved on, I just want to point out, so you see Crosswise Lake and Cobalt Lake both received mine waste and tailings from several different mines and mills in the region. Crosswise Lake here feeds north into Far Creek wetland, where there's contaminated sediments now, and LaRose Pond received tailings from the LaRose mine and mill. And here I wanted to show the contrast between tailings on the left, that are this light gray, fine grain material, compared to these black, sludgy, mud-like sediments from the bottom of LaRose Pond, which are mixed in with some of those gray tailings as well. These textural differences come into play when we consider the different chemistries of these materials. So what did I actually do with these samples? So for the tailings and sediments, we did geochemistry work with ICP-MS and aqua regia digestion. Mineralogy work is being done with the scanning electron microscope with automated mineralogy, as well as electron microprobe analysis. For the horsetails, we are analyzing the chemistry of these by a hydrogen peroxide and nitric acid digestion with ICP-MS and ES finish. And I wanted to show a picture of what the horsetail sample actually looked like at these sites. And the roots penetrated deep into the tailings. So part of what I did for this lab work was to separate the roots carefully from these tailings, clean them super well with deionized water, as well as the shoots. And then I separated the roots and shoots for separate chemical analyses. All right, into the results. So I wanted to point out before I got started that for this presentation, I focus on arsenic, cobalt, and mercury chemistry. However, there's lots of different elements in the cobalt region that are worth looking at. Just for time restraints today, I wanted to focus on these 3 big elements. Okay, so starting with arsenic, I've shown the tailings and sediments from the 4 sites with these gray bars, and the benthic sediments from LaRose Pond are shown by the red bars. The horsetail tissue are shown with dots for different colors, orange for the roots and green for the shoots. And one thing that I noticed right away is that the arsenic at Cobalt Lake is the highest, but the benthic sediments actually tend to have higher arsenic than the tailings and sediments. The horsetail tissues sometimes contain higher arsenic than the tailings, which is really interesting. And consistently, we see concentration of arsenic in the roots relative to the shoots of the plant. I have a similar plot for cobalt. Here, once again, Cobalt Lake has the highest cobalt content. And for this sample, it was about 3,600 ppm, which I thought was quite interesting considering this is an area where they're considering mining cobalt again, and here it is in the lake sediments and tailings. But here we see that the horsetail tissue has less cobalt content than the tailings at the site. However, once again, the Larose benthic sediments have quite high cobalt content, almost 9,000 ppm in these deep benthic sediments, which is about 10 meters deep for context. For mercury, I wanted to point out for this graph, I have a separate y-axis for the horsetail tissue. So the horsetails have quite a bit lower mercury content than the tailings and sediments. So just keep that in mind. But what we see here is very high mercury concentrations in these benthic sediments exceeding 40 ppm and high mercury content as well at the Larose samples. What's interesting is that Cobalt Lake doesn't have the highest mercury content. However, the horsetail tissues do have higher mercury content than some other sites, including Larose Pond. This might be telling us something about the bioavailability of mercury at this site, which is something that we could follow up with, possibly with mineralogy work. Okay, so I wanted to touch quickly on some of the mineralogy work I've done so far. So far, I've only looked at these samples from 2019, but what I found is that cobalt is mostly hosted in primary ore minerals. And you can see on the left here, this scatterudite grain, which is surrounded by an oxidized iron, arsenic, and calcium rim. This oxidized iron, arsenic, calcium phase is important. It shows up at all 4 locations, and it occurs quite a bit at the Larose Pond sample, especially in association with organic material. So these are some phases that have already jumped out at me, and they appear to be important. We've also found cobalt in oxidized phases as erythrite, however, not to the same extent as this oxidized iron, arsenic, calcium phase. So my key findings so far are that arsenic, cobalt, and mercury are present in high concentrations in sediments and tailings at the cobalt mining camp, as well as in the horsetails that are growing on these wastes. And the horsetails tend to concentrate elements in their roots instead of the shoots, which leads me to believe that they're playing an important role in biogeochemical cycling elements in this region. Preliminary mineralogy work has showed that arsenic and cobalt are hosted in primary ore minerals, and as well as secondary phases, secondary oxidized phases, but to a lesser extent, cobalt is oxidized phase. My next steps will be to do more mineralogy work on the sediments and tailings I collected in 2021. And I'll also be doing shake flask experiments to understand the leachability, so to speak, of these wastes. And I wanted to conclude by saying that silver mining in Cobalt, Ontario certainly has impacts on the environment that we're still learning about today. And the geochemistry of mine waste in the cobalt region must be considered when we're thinking of revegetating the land, the impact on plants, as well as reprocessing waste or even starting new mining activities. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Melissa. As she said, any questions for her?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Melissa. We're doing like a very similar research. We'll see for my presentation after, but if you can go to your arsenic concentrations, did I read it right that you found concentrations like 10,000 ppm for arsenic?
So yes, so Cobalt Lake tailings and sediments is just under 8,000 ppm.
Yeah.
The highest being in these benthic sediments from LaRose Pond, nearly 10,000. Actually, it exceeded 10,000, but we're waiting on more analytical results. They're rerunning that sample. It's really interesting because I showed earlier, like these two samples are very different texturally. So these are like the muddy, very fine grained, sludgy samples deep from the pond.
Cool. That's interesting. Thanks.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Melissa?
I've got a question, if that's all right. So I'm not very familiar with this subject. I was just curious as to why the benthic sediments seem to generally be higher in these contaminants than the tailings.
Yeah, so that is something that we're still figuring out. So, one idea we have is that part of what makes these like benthic sediments so like slimy and black is organic material. So we're wondering if that is playing a role in kind of acting as a sink. And so that's something that we'll need a little bit more investigating. We're going to do some organic carbon analysis. And like I mentioned, I haven't yet looked at the mineralogy of the samples I collected in 2021. So that might also tell us something there.
Thanks. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, just a quick thing. Are you going to try and incorporate some of the water chemistry into all this? Because it's all solid phase at the moment, and this is clearly a solid water rock water interactions. Is that the plan in the?
That's a great question. So I myself didn't collect water samples, but in 2019 they were collected by Mike Parsons and his team. And so we do have some data, but we haven't talked a lot about if and how it will be incorporated. But definitely something to consider. Thank you for mentioning that.
Christine, did you want to jump in?
Just a quick question. Thanks, very good presentation, Melissa. Are there other plants that can grow on these tailings, or is the one you studied the most widely spread, or
yeah,
something else that can grow on that? Or
good question. So when we visited in July, at the wetland there where there was migration of tailings, so there are contaminated sediments there, and there are cattails growing. And so there have been studies in this region on cattails taking up elements, and there are also grasses that are growing. It just so happened that when we went in July, we noticed horsetails growing at each and every site, and they just seem very important in this story. So we thought, why not take them home with us and see what we can find out? But yes, to answer your question, there are other plants. I guess it just so happened that horsetails seem to be dominating areas that were not really vegetated by anything else. So at Crosswise Lake, it's almost like a big tidal flat of tailings, and there's horsetails just growing right in the center with nothing else. Whereas in the wetland area, there's different plants growing. So maybe, yeah, it seems to be the first one to get there, if so to speak, if that makes sense.
okay, thanks.
We're at 14 minutes. Jason, do you want to just quickly ask your question? We'll move on after that.
No, actually, Christine asked my question. I was just curious if you did a comparison with other plants, but that was it.
Perfect.